Hello, everyone, and happy Friday to all. Welcome to the final episode of December, the final guest for the lineup of December. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining me today is another author from my Inkitt days. Now, my guest today was born in Lafayette, Louisiana, in the heart of Cajun Country, and she began writing at a young age, but started focusing on novels in 2016 when she just couldn't stop daydreaming and writing down ideas. She moved to the UK in 2018 and now lives in England with her husband. And if you follow her on social media, Child of the Flowers is her first official novel. And I'm so excited to have this person on the show. I've known this person, as I said, from my Inkitt days. It's been an absolute blast talking with her on that before this interview. So, without further ado, allow me to introduce our final guest for the month of December, author Mollie DeMoor, otherwise known as MB DeMoor. DeMoor, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Of course, of course. Now, Demore, before we dive deep into your book, Child of the Flowers, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners?
Um, Maybe this would be a good time to share what the book looks like. I've got it here in
Of
my hand.
course.
Yeah. So here it is. Might be backwards or inverted. So,
Oh, no, it's good. It's perfect.
perfect. Here it is. And we've got the side here and the back with the description. Um, and right now it's only available in paperback or an ebook, but the goal is to get the hardcover copy available by January. So crossing my fingers that we can manage to do that. um,
Awesome.
yeah, so that's where I'm at the moment. This has been a very slow process for me. I don't 100% know what I'm doing, and I am doing it myself. So yeah, but that's where I'm at right now.
Awesome. So, as a little teaser for our viewers and listeners, what can you tell us of Child of the Flowers?
So, um, the actual blurb I thought maybe was a little too long, so I tried to shorten it a little bit here. And also, apologies if you see me look away. I've got my two screens up here just so I can help myself remember how I
Oh,
answer
you're fine.
questions. um, but Child of the Flowers is about a young mage. She's a strong female lead. Her name is Sky, and she's been living under the oppressive regime of Archmage Sicarius, and she's been training to be the next Archmage. But due to the circumstances that she's been living under, she plans to run away from it all, give up everything, and she gets away for a little bit, but the plan completely backfires, and she ends up on this journey with a bunch of unexpected characters, sort of I would definitely say that the book has a found family trope,
Okay.
a little bit of a romance plot as well. It's not the main focus, but it is there. And it ends up on it ends up with my main character Sky on this journey to overthrow the Archmage and get him out of power. But as most stories go, it doesn't exactly all go according to plan, and things go very up and down for her. And I'd say she's definitely more of an anti-hero, sort of morally gray sort of character. Um, and I tried to make her, very strong, but also relatable. She's got
Mm.
rough edges, but she's got soft edges as well. Um, and I guess to finish that up, it's an entirely fictional world, something that I pulled just right out of my head. And it's got an astrology-based magic system. Uh,
Ooh, okay.
yeah, so I don't necessarily like believe in astrology, but I do find it really interesting as a concept, like as a
Mm.
concept, because um, I'm a Virgo and I love reading my horoscope and I love all, learning what my personality traits are and all of that. And I just had the idea to sort of create a magic system based around that, um, which is a major sort of factor in the book. as well.
Awesome. I don't think I've had a lot of authors, whenever they've written books that have like a magic-based system. I don't think I've ever had one author say like it was like based on astrology, because when it comes to like writing magic, as we will touch on a little bit later in the interview, when it comes to crafting the book and everything, there are so many different roads to go through. So I'm really intrigued to learn more about this. But before we dive into the creation of Child of the Flowers, DeMoor, let's actually go back in time to you growing up.
Okay.
So would you say growing up you were always a creative child, or did your creativity for writing stories come about later in your life?
I wrote a lot of little short stories when I was a child, probably not like super young, probably when I was about 12. I still have a notebook, and it's written in crayon. It's very childish. Um, of this story, and it's basically just Peter Pan. But I just remember having this idea to write down, and I ended up writing it down in crayons, and it's really just gibberish now looking back. But as a child, I really had sort of already had that spark of creativity, I think. But it took me quite a long time to sort of hone that into a talent or into a craft, because I enjoyed the process of writing, and I had a big imagination, and I had a lot of things to say, but I didn't really know how to say them and how to make things make sense. It wasn't until I became more of a heavy reader that sort of, I don't know. So when I became a big reader, it supported my desire and ability to write, because a lot of people say, write the book that you want to read,
Right.
And I think that, as well as just growing up, I took a lot of classes in English. I just honed my writing skills as I got older as well. So I'd say that it started out as a child, but didn't really come to fruition until I was in my 20s, until I was an adult, where I actually started writing and making more than just like incoherent sort of crayon written stories, where I actually typed them up and wrote an outline and started really putting my ideas to paper.
Okay. So would you say that is your aha moment where you realize that you want to become a writer, but not so much in the sense of like passion, in so to speak, but possibly making a future career out of this?
I'd say that the aha moment was definitely around 2016, 2017. So I would have been grown up by then, whereas everything before was really just me sort of jotting down ideas, sort of nothing really solid, just sort of, I always refer to it as having dots with no lines. They were just sort of dots, little ideas. But in 27, I can't remember if it was 16 or 17, so take that with a grain of salt. One of those years, I was listening to a song on YouTube, and the thumbnail or the cover art for this song was this like hooded figure. I think it was a woman. It's like a hooded figure, and they had a stone necklace, and the stone was sort of glowing, and it was just very sort of ominous, very matched the tone of the song as well. It was an instrumental as well. And I don't know, I can pinpoint the moment where I just had this idea about a mage like running away from something. She runs away from something, and something bad's gonna happen, and then I got home and just like, I think 6 or 7 chapters of spilled out of me, where I named this character, and I started imagining what she looked like and started putting those dots down, and didn't necessarily have the lines yet. And that was, I'd say, was my aha moment, where I thought, I have an actual potential story here that, if I keep going and keep feeling inspired and keep having ideas to continue, this could become an actual story, which it did eventually. It took quite a long time. It didn't actually take me that long to write it. The publishing process took a long time, but once I had that first idea, it was just sort of a pretty quick process after that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That's actually very, very true. A lot of my guests have said the same thing, that it wasn't so much as well. Writing definitely did take a long time because stories change over the years. We realize that the outlines that we had initially don't work now. So of course the story is going to change a little bit, but definitely the publication and the marketing of the book is definitely going to be the biggest hassle and hurdle. So now let's fast forward to the creation of Child of the Flowers.
Mm-hmm.
So walk me through it. So you've now had the story in your head for a while now. You're definitely going to write it. You've jotted down the outline and are beginning to write the first draft. Now, when you began writing the first draft, this is a two-part question. What were the goals you had for yourself as the author going forward, as well as the goals and promises you were making to your future readers and audience?
So when I first started writing the outline, I didn't get it completed. Like, I started the outline, wrote probably about 3/4 of the outline, and got impatient and started writing the actual draft before my outline was finished. And
Ah,
I ended up getting to a point where the draft met the outline, the unfinished outline, and I ended up getting stuck for a few months. And it
mm,
wasn't necessarily writer's block because I was still having ideas. It's just that I couldn't connect two of my dots, if that makes sense. I couldn't get
right,
from this point to this point. And so at that time, I hadn't even really thought about publishing or showing it to anyone. It was definitely a personal passion project that I had talked about with my friends, like, oh, I'm writing a book. But I didn't really tell anyone what it was about, because even back then I didn't fully know what the end game was for, if that makes
right.
sense. But once I had a inspiration, like a burst of inspiration, and I finally thought, I know how to connect this point to this point, and wrote it, and then finally finished the first draft. um, I thought, wow, okay, I actually wrote an entire book. It needs work. This is a first draft,
Of course.
but I wrote a whole book. Do I want to share this or not? And I kind of deliberated over that for a while, if I wanted to actually publish it, like actually go towards publishing it, or just keep it to myself. But I don't know. And since you're also a writer,
Hmm.
you will probably be able to relate to this, but it's almost like my characters were like, publish me. um, I want you
Yes.
to read me. Um, and over time, it became pretty obvious to me, I want to publish this book and put it out into the world. Um, and that definitely took time. I tried to get it traditionally published, submitted queries to agents, like 100 of them. Um,
Hmm.
but I didn't get any offers or anything like that. And after some time, I thought, I'm gonna just do it myself. Which I did.
You know what? Absolutely. That is very, very true. And you actually brought up something that we will be touching on later in the marketing side, which is, of course, the road to publication, hybrid, traditional, indie, and how it's pretty much, a 50-50 on which one works for each individual person.
Yeah.
So now moving forward in time, so after you've written the first draft, and of course, I imagine you may have done beta readers and ARC readers for this, as well as getting a cover artist and an editor to look over the book and have the book exactly the way you want it.
Yeah.
So once you did all of that, before even publishing it, what were the initial reactions like? Were they positive, negative, or somewhere in the middle?
You mean like from my beta readers and ARCs and all of that?
Yes, from the first people who reviewed it before you officially published it.
So the first people who read it were actually the people on Inkitt.
Really?
I would consider Inkitt sort of like my alpha readers, because I put it up there to meet other writers, but also to share it with people and get that feedback without officially sort of making it available as a beta read yet, because I didn't think it was quite there, but I did want people to be able to read it and give me feedback, because after a while, since I was struggling to get it taken on by an agent, since I was feeling like very low motivation and discouraged, and I thought maybe this will help point out things maybe I'm missing. Because, you know, when you read a book that you wrote and have read 100 times, it's very easy to miss things and read between those lines. And so the first people who read the book were on Inkitt, and I had a few people who really loved it, and they were like, oh my gosh, this is so cool, this is amazing, can't wait till it's published, can't wait till it's finished. And then I had some good feedback as well that wasn't necessarily negative, just critical, and the biggest piece of feedback I'd say from my Inkitt readers was, your female main character's mean and she's dislikable. I don't like her. I can't relate to her. And, you know, at first I was like, but she's supposed to be, but she's a tough, you know, and the more I thought about it, the more I was like, that's actually excellent feedback, because I ended up sort of softening her edges a little. And it caused me to rethink my main character, how she was portrayed versus how I wanted her to be portrayed. And it caused me to rethink everything about her and how I wrote her. And I did a complete overhaul of my main character, which is crazy.
Okay.
To keep the integrity of how I wanted her to be, but to also make her a bit more relatable and realistic, which I feel now that I succeeded with, because I've had people now say, oh, I love her, she's so tough, but she's also emotional, and, you know, got layers of complexity that I think just weren't there in my first draft, even though I wanted them to be there. And then once I made all of those, you know, adjustments and corrections and took on all that feedback, good, bad, and in between, I did a complete sort of rewrite and self-edit. And it wasn't until I had a developmental editor who was amazing, fantastic. He did a great job. And he was professionally very critical. He was like, just to give some examples, he said, you know, your main character runs away from her home and goes on this adventure, but I don't feel attached to what she has left behind. You haven't given me enough of what she's leaving behind. I don't have that emotional reaction that I'm assuming you want me to have. And I said, that's excellent criticism. Like, yes. Okay, thank you. And so I ended up rewriting almost the entirety of my first 3 chapters to emphasize, like, okay, this is what my main character is giving up. And it's meant to be an emotionally charged situation. And I ended up, he also said, oh, but her escape plan wasn't believable, and just excellent advice. And I rewrote all of it. And I came out of that rewrite when I finished it all up and reread it. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's 10 times better. And it kept the original sort of shape of the book that I wrote, but just added so many layers of complexity and realism. Even it's in a fantasy setting, but like realism, you hopefully know what I mean.
Yes, of course.
Relatability in my characters, and things started to make more sense. And by the time now that it's published, I don't necessarily have a lot of the anxieties that I did have at first. You know, like, oh, is my book too long? Is my character too mean and unrelatable? You know, does her escape plan make sense? I haven't received any sort of negative feedback around those elements, which was really nice, because I was really anxious about that when I first put it out into the world. Yeah, I think I answered your question.
Yes, yes, and yes, DeMoor, you absolutely did. And I can kind of lead into the next 2 questions, but I'll start with the first one. So, would you agree that from those initial reactions, and then of course, once you published the book, you got a new set of reviews, that those reviews validated your goals as an author and writer of telling a great original story? And Also, as you just mentioned, kind of easing your anxiety as an author.
Absolutely. And my book hasn't been out that long, and I don't have like hundreds of reviews or anything. So this is obviously me pulling from a pretty small pool of comments and reviews so far. Um, but one of the things that I worked really hard on was my world building technique, style, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because as a reader, I don't necessarily enjoy too much like lore dumping. I like to be fed the lore when it's needed, as on a
Mm.
need to know basis. And so that's how I wrote it. And I was a little bit worried, like, oh, what if people don't like that? Or, typical sort of what if. And in my review, several people have said, I love the way you've written your world building. And I thought, oh, the validation, because I worked so hard to do that. And it really goes to show, I think, how, um, you know, anxieties or doubts or whatever you want to call them change over time as you make as you make the edits and you make the changes and you have different sort of levels of readership. Because obviously, when it was on Inkitt, it was full of mistakes. It was not its final form. It was a baby, and
Right.
by the time it's published now, it's had a developmental editor, a copy editor, it's had beta readers, ARC readers, like it's had everything, and it is at as final of a form as it will have. And to get those types of comments and reviews and feedback at this stage is very reassuring. It's very intimidating as well. I mean, I do know at some point it's not going to be someone's cup of tea, um, and I'm preparing myself for that eventuality. I think someone's out there is going to be like, this isn't for me. But at the moment, I've got a really, really positive feedback from people, which touches on the things that I was focused on while writing, if that makes sense.
Right. Absolutely. And this kind of leads into the second question, which I would like to call the first reflective reflective question. Now, DeMoor, as I'm sure you definitely agree that being an author, there is this level of vulnerability because our writings are in some way a reflection of some aspect of our character. And to create that, you have to be very vulnerable.
Yeah.
And to publish and share it, it also adds another layer of vulnerability because, we don't know if people are going to like this or people are going to be open minded to it and so forth. And especially now with the new age of social media is a great tool for indie authors. It allows us to reach our audience far and wide and allow us new avenues to publish our books. Now, with the addition of self publishing, which has only been around, I want to say maybe 10 years or so with, Barnes and Noble and now, of course, Amazon. But also with, social media, I say it's a double edged sword because you also are allowing yourself to be targeted by trolls, by scammers, and everything, and
Mm.
especially scammers for indie authors who get drawn in by these people who pretend to be agents of well-respected publishing houses and so forth, and that leads, of course, to vanity publishing, which we'll touch on later. And going back to the sense of anxiety, publishing your first story now is like there is like that anxiety, that buildup of whether or not people are going to accept it or not, but also a level of imposter syndrome where that voice is in the back of all of our minds telling us that our story's not going to be good, no one's going to read it, we have wasted too much time and money on this, which that's another thing we will touch on later. So, DeMoor, I would like to ask you, have you ever had those moments of imposter syndrome or anxiety? And if so, or if not, what has disciplined you to continue on this journey of being an author?
Um, yes. So there were several points in time leading up to the publication date, right? Because I published it myself. Like I said, I tried to do it traditionally, really struggled, um, and ultimately chose to publish it myself. Didn't know what I was doing, still don't. Um, but when it comes to imposter syndrome, it didn't hit me too much until I was sort of approaching my release date. Where I was like, I could just cancel it. I could just say, never mind, don't want to do this anymore. And I don't know, I had this like two voices, right? This one was like, the book's gonna suck. Everyone's gonna hate it. It's boring. All these negative sort of thoughts. And then the other part of me was like, but you've made it this far. Keep going. You've talked about it with so many people. They're looking forward to it. And then this voice would be like, it's not going to live up to the hype. They're going to read it and be like, what was the deal? Ultimately, it sort of boils down to me desperately pushing through those negative thoughts. And I know that's a cliche, but I had to think, I don't want my book to sit in my computer forever.
Right.
Or to sit in my head forever. I've done all of this work. I got the cover art. I've drawn the maps. For what? For me to look at? I wanted other people to read it. And I think that sort of was a driving force, just to think, no, you want people to read it. And I think you'll be dissatisfied if it just stays in your PC forever. And it was really scary, especially with like scammers and trolls and some people are mean for like no reason. Right. I am still anxious about that, to be honest with you. Not necessarily criticism, and I understand that some people might not like I said, it might not be their cup of tea. They might not finish it. They might think, no, it's not for me. And that's absolutely fine. It's only when people are like really mean about it. Some people are just mean. I haven't experienced that yet. And I think it's because no one knows who I am. My book isn't like big. I haven't even advertised it yet. I just like published it and thought, okay, I did it. I'm gonna sit for a bit and relax because the whole process stressed me out. So I'm sort of, I know you didn't necessarily ask this, but I'll say it anyways. I'm a little bit on the fence of, do I want to be perceived and have a bunch more people get to know me and my book and read it? Or am I happy as an unknown person with like a tiny readership? Like, which is it? And to be honest, I don't even know. I don't know. Part of me is like, oh, but you did all this. You don't you want like a bunch of readers? And it's like, yeah, but then that's a little scary also.
Definitely. And that kind of leads into the next set of questions, which is what I call the business portion of being an author. So I guess as a little icebreaker, we'll just go into the first question. So as you just said previously, DeMoor, you went the route of independent publishing, but I am curious. Did you? I know you said you tried to go the traditional way, you sending out query letters, and I've noticed that a lot of authors, even of course traditional, hybrid, and especially indie authors, they've all said the same thing, which is, more than ever, the gatekeepers of traditional publishing make it harder for new authors to showcase their work. So, in your opinion, would you have felt this sense of confidence if you had been accepted by a traditional publishing house as opposed to an indie author, or if you had to do it all over again, would you have still gone the way of the indie author?
I think if I had to do it again, I would still self-publish, which I never thought I would hear myself saying. But I think, as cool as it would have been to say, oh, I have an agent and I'm published to a publisher, and there's a lot of restrictions that come with that as well. Having to cut content that I might otherwise not have cut, and not having control over the cover art or other artwork in the book or illustrations. Having to make changes based on marketability rather than my own creative engine, And I think that when I first started querying to agents, it was definitely a case of, oh, I won't be able to do this unless it's through a agent and publisher. And that was my mindset for a long time, where I was just like, well, I can't self-publish. And the more I thought about it, the more I was just like, no, because it's a trade-off, because now I've got all of the like control / freedom. It's mine. The royalties are mine. The artwork's mine. I didn't cut things that I might otherwise. I mean, look at this, massive. It's a big book.
It is.
It's, and to me, everything in here is supposed to be in here.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the other hand, as I mentioned a minute ago, no one knows who I am. No one knows my book exists except like a handful of people. And that's because I don't get the benefit, the added bonus of everything being marketed and advertised for me. So I'm doing it all myself. And I don't know. I feel like I've veered off a bit, but I think if I did have to choose again, I would self-publish, and I'm gonna self-publish the second one. Like I don't want to query agents anymore. I don't want my book to be evaluated based on how well would it do compared to other books, and has nothing to do with other books. It's my book. I wrote it. Right. And I don't want to be dependent on how other books and I understand that's how marketing works, but as a creative who put so much work into this, it's like, no, I just want to put it out there and we'll see what happens. Like, I'm not that big on, I work full time, so I'm not writing to make a living at this moment. I'm doing it just because I love it. And I know that's maybe cliche, I don't know, but that's where I'm at the moment. I mean, it would be cool if more people knew about it. That's why I'm trying to network and meet people, but it's not necessarily my main goal at the moment, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads, another thing just to add on to that before I go forward. I think a lot of, especially for first-time authors, we all have the dreams of going into the big houses like Simon Schuster, Macmillan's, Penguin Random House, Tor, Ford. I mean, those are some pretty big ones. Del Rey is another imprint. But, there is a sense of, the gatekeepers, blocking out these amazing books. Because, of course, to give them their dues, it is a business for them. They have built a brand where they have to realize, is this book going to make us a lot of money? And to their part, I understand that they also have to make, some form of compensation from this. But I definitely think, as authors, an avenue that I don't think gets explored a lot is the small publishing houses that are not on the East Coast, maybe local in the area, but have had an established community that has stood by them. So I think that's another avenue to also explore if you go the route of, if you want to go traditional, or even traditional down the road, is to look at the small houses, because the small houses will definitely reach out. They will definitely take your book into consideration. You probably will get a better feedback than the other ones. And I'm saying this from experience, in the sense I've met a lot of authors who have been published through these small publishing houses, and it's been an incredible experience for them. And talking about, brands and audience and so forth, let's actually focus on that aspect of DeMoor. So for Child of the Flower, what was the audience that you were particularly marketing to, as well as the genre? Because that is something that is a little bit challenging, in the sense that when we write the books, we're not taking into consideration who the audience is or the genre that it belongs to. You say, oh, this has fantasy elements or it's urban fantasy. Well, does it fall under those categories, or did you just incorporate them because they just felt right into the story? So, DeMoor, what were your thoughts in that aspect of the business side of Child of the Flower? And as an add-on to that, when did you take into consideration the audience for your book and the future books in this series?
So, I didn't really, as you mentioned a second ago, I didn't really think about that while I was writing it. I was just sort of writing it. And it goes back to the write what you want to read aspect.
Right.
And I personally, so I ended up targeting the book, calling it a new adult, which is sort of a in-between genre that a lot of agents don't even recognize new adult, at least not yet. Maybe they will one day, but I didn't. My book isn't young adult because my protagonists are in their late 20s and 30s. Like, they are full-grown adults. But then there's no, like, I think there's like one curse word in the book. There's like one curse word, so there's not a bunch of bad. There's not a lot of language, like adult language. There's no spice in it. There's not really any like gore or violence either. I mean, there's a couple of scenes in the book which might make you go, ooh, ugh, you know, but it's nothing crazy that I thought fit into the adult genre either. And I really struggled with that because I was like, well, the book has a lot of young adult elements where I feel like younger people could probably read it. Younger people as in like teenagers, not like kids. It's not a kid's book.
Right.
It's more older teenagers. But it's also not necessarily just for them either. Like, I don't think a teenager would relate to my protagonists because they're too young. But I also think if someone saw, oh, this is marketed as an adult, and they went into it and it was pretty like clean, and they might be like, well, where's the adult aspect here? And so I really struggled with that. Honestly, I really struggled with that until I finally sort of landed on new adult. And that was a risk that I took because when I submitted my query letter to agents and I put it as new adults, I did have a few agents say, you need to pick either young adult or adult. And I'm like, well, that's like the issue I didn't want to have.
Right.
But sorry, you had a second part to your question. Can you repeat the second part of your question to me?
Of course. So, the second part of the question is, when did you take into consideration the audience for your book as well as the future books in the series?
Right. Sorry. Thank you. That was when I started querying to agents because it was part of the sort of requirements of a query letter. And that was also when I started thinking about the genre and, you know, who I wanted to focus like advertising or marketing it to. Because it's a fantasy, it's a high fantasy because it is completely fictional, made up. It's not based in the real world. There's no like portals or anything like that. But it's also not like Lord of the Rings type high fantasy or Game of Thrones where it's like dragons, and it's not tied into like real world events either. It was just a completely made up fictional world, but it wasn't that like, you know, with elves and dwarves and not that type of fantasy. So I really struggled with that as well because I was like, well, where does it fit? Because it is high fantasy, but it's not that kind of high fantasy. It's not low fantasy either. It's not necessarily romance or romantasy either, because the romance in the book is more of a side plot. It's slow, very slow burn. There's no spice. It's not the main focus, but it is there. So I always sort of put fantasy with a little bit of romance, but I think I eventually classified it as a fantasy adventure, sprinkling of romance, with a focus on the magic system and world building, because that and my main character's sort of inner monologue thoughts, that's what I wanted to focus on, rather than like a romance plot or anything like that. Even though it's there, it's not the main focus. And so, yeah, I ended up classifying it as new adult, fantasy adventure, a little bit of romance.
All right. And I think you've already touched on this before when it came to, you know, the readership, because, you know, within the audience, there is the readership. Yeah. And you've already answered this question in the sense that, you know, your book falls under the new adult category, which a lot of authors that I've talked to have mentioned that it is an underrepresented reader group, where there are books that are classified as new adult, where they are a transition from young adult to adult fiction. So, as a writer, what was the challenge of crafting a new adult story as opposed to either just going full on young adult or full on adult fiction?
So I never personally thought of my book as young adult. The only reason I ever went back and forth was because of when I was querying and trying to pick the right one. But I personally never saw it as young adult simply because my characters were just too old.
Right.
They're not old, but they're it's not like new age. They weren't teenagers. They weren't like, learning about themselves or anything like that. They were definitely well established in their 20s and 30s, but also because my main character, Sky, it's her name.
Right.
She's 24 in the book, and I was 24 when I came up with her. And I wrote her at that age because that was the best. I could relate to her the best because I was the same age as her. So you can imagine my frustration as it took me ages to get to the publishing stage, and I had to keep editing, and I had out-aged my main character by like 6 years. But I went back and forth as well with, okay, well, if I have to classify it as adult, should I add more language? Should I add more gory scenes or spice? Should I include this to make it fit into this, bracket? Ultimately, I didn't want to because it just didn't fit my characters. And I'm going to sound very cliche, but you'll understand, you're a writer, other writers will understand. The book almost writes itself after a while. The characters write themselves, and they weren't characters who aren't characters who you constantly use bad language, have spice. They're not focused on all of that. They're on an adventure. They have a goal. They have stuff to do. It just didn't work for me.
Right.
And I didn't necessarily want to write out gory scenes or make anything extra than it needed to be for the sake of it to fit into the adult category, if that makes sense. I didn't want to change it just for that. So I didn't, which is why it ended up falling into new adult, because neither of them ever worked for me. Yeah, if that answers the question.
That does answer the question, because it is true. Now more than ever, we have young adult and adult fiction, which are like the two dominant ones, but new adult is making its way through, and it's kind of like the middle child. It's not so much, the youngest, but they sure are not the oldest. So they're trying to find their place in the publishing world. And that also kind of leads to the next question, which is a very fun one.
Oh.
And this one comes from an author that I had earlier this year, Eric Bowden, where I asked him the original question, which was, who were the authors that inspired him to help him craft his authorial voice? But he turned it on its head and gave a different answer to a different question, which is, well, he pretty much said, I could give you all the authors just like any other guest, but I'm going to change it because at the end of the day, I'm not trying to be like anyone else. I'm not trying to write like someone else. And I think a lot of authors kind of forget that, yes, we're always inspired by the people we grew up reading. But at the end of the day, for us as authors, we want to showcase our voice, our approach to the subject matter, not someone else, because we're not trying to be like anybody else. And I'm sure, DeMoor, as a reader, you've probably seen books that have had the tagline, so-and-so meets so-and-so.
Yeah.
And from a reader's point of view, that's enticing. For an author, that's kind of like a jail sentence where we're being confined to either one style of writing or one genre of writing. Now, there are, of course, authors who specialize in one genre of writing, which, is all the power to them. But then you have authors who are cross-genre that can write a wide range of fiction or nonfiction, and it shows that they are very versatile. So for you, DeMoor, how has been this challenge of balancing, your individuality as an author, but also respecting, the genre that you're writing in from the titans of the industry or the books you've read growing up as a child?
So I'm definitely more inclined to writing fantasy just because. So I actually have a whole other book written that's in my computer right now. Don't know if I ever want to publish it. Maybe. It's a historical fiction.
Ooh, all right.
Completely different than Child of the Flowers or any of my other projects that are sitting in my head or my computer.
Mm.
And I love the story. I'm proud of it. I think it could be nice. But I really struggled with historical fiction personally because it is restricted by rules of the real world, rules of history. Even though it's a fictional story, you're sort of bound by the real world. Whereas with fantasy, you're not really bound by anything. You can do whatever you want, pretty much.
Yes.
And I think when it comes to like the comparisons that you mentioned, that is a whole can of worms with me because, oh my goodness, trying to do that, like you said, it does feel like a little confinement cell because it's like this book is this meets this, and this is what this author is good at and writes, which would make me really sort of scared to publish something like my historical fiction, which is vastly different. The historical fiction that I wrote is half of it's from first person. It takes place in 2 different time periods. Like it's a whole thing that's like night and day compared to Child of the Flowers. It was a whole different writing style, everything. And personally, when I had to come up with my comps, as they call them, my comparisons,
right,
I couldn't even think of other books. And it's not necessarily my book is so unique and I can't compare it to anyone. It wasn't even necessarily just like that. It was like, I don't know, because my book can borrow my book. Sorry, let me rephrase. My inspiration could be attributed to a little bit from this, a little bit from this, and a little bit from that. And all of these different types of fantasy elements inspired me or appealed to me as a reader, which is why, I mean, I ultimately compared it to Dragon Age.
Ooh, okay.
And various like RPGs and stuff like that. It's got a little bit of Avatar: The Last Airbender vibe, but my characters aren't like children on a quest. It's just sort of the magic that's sort of similar, but then not all of it, just a little bit of it. And with Dragon Age / RPGs, I think that I pulled a lot of inspiration from that, which isn't a book. It's not like when I was querying to agents, I really struggled with that. And to be honest with you, at the time, I was in a huge reading slump. So I wasn't necessarily even reading enough of what was popular on the market or what was big at the time. Now I'm much more of a big reader now. I ended up getting a Kindle Unlimited subscription and just went on this like high of just reading. I've read like 60 books this year. It's insane. And I mostly read fantasy because that's what I enjoy all around.
Same here.
But yeah, I don't know if I would ever not publish my historical fiction just because my first book is fantasy. But I also, going back to a previous discussion, I think that's because I self-published and I have the freedom to really do that. Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna ramble if I keep going.
No, absolutely, I completely understand, and gotta move out of frame for a little bit. Like, I know exactly what you mean. Like, for me, of course, when we first met on Inkitt, I only began writing, historical fiction, and at the time, this was the only book that I had out next to The Gathering. And then, of course, after which you had Michael, which was my first fantasy book that I've ever done. And if you can tell, it's a lot bigger than Amanus by several pages, and it was a challenge. I love writing fantasy, but I never knew how to exactly get the book exactly the way I want it. And now with my fourth book, I'm working on right now, I'm getting back to my roots of writing history. I definitely enjoy it. And now I'm also working on another project in secret. I told a few people about this, but it's a World War II story. But this one, it's that World War II story. It's one of those stories where it follows two characters, two different characters. They're from different aspects of life, and you follow their story, or you begin with their story in 1941 on the precipice of World War II, and then you go back to 1929. So you're seeing at least several decades before and what their childhoods were like that shaped them into the people they are. And that right now is a challenge, but it's a fun one. And, one thing I've learned about, this industry so far is that it's a hustle, it's a grind, especially when it comes to, publishing, whether it's indie, traditional, or hybrid. It's not easy. Marketing is probably one of the most challenging things for all authors. And one thing I think you mentioned early, DeMoor, which we're going to touch on now, in the sense of the kind of writer you want to be. Did you want to have a writer with a very large fan base, so people know who you were? Or did you want to be sort of like an obscure writer that only had a few readers, a few loyal fans following you? And that's a really big discussion for all authors to consider when they go down into this industry. This sense of like, do you want to be a writer who's writing for as a hobby, or do you want to be a commercial fiction writer? Because that's a big commitment. And this leads to a discussion which I've had now going on 6 years after interviewing now, I want to say maybe like 100 plus authors in 2 years. And it's pretty much this discussion, which is for all authors, hybrid, traditional, or indie, there are two roads for us: to be an author, to be known as an author. One is dedicated to storytelling and honing the craft. The other is dedicated to marketing and showcasing their work. Now, both have their own set of trials, but I definitely feel for first-time authors, the second road, to be known as an author, is the most enticing, because we all want to be known as authors in this day and age. But that leads to a lot of unrealistic goals and expectations, in the sense that we're going to be award-winning, successful authors, New York Times bestseller, Amazon #1, whatever. But the truth of the matter is, regardless of what type of author you are, there's no guarantee that first book is going to give you everything you want. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it's true. There are exceptions, of course, to this. There are authors whose first book did give them that status, and that's not an easy thing to do. But generally speaking, you have this roller coaster of highs and lows, which, of course, attributes from the unrealistic expectations that you set out, where you try to make your muse your main source of income, which that's another thing to mention. Being an author is not a get-rich-quick scheme. I've been doing this for about now, started back in 2020. It's not a money-making machine. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of hustle and grind, and it's sometimes can be deflating for authors when they're not getting the royalties they're expecting, and that can deter them away from writing. So I pose this to you, DeMoor. What is your thought on this discussion? And for you as an author, have you ever felt this yourself?
I think that it puts a lot of pressure on people, whether it's from an audience, themselves. I think personally, for me, it would be cool, right, if I like won an award or did a book signing or something like that.
Right.
But I don't really know if that's where I want to go with it all. I mean, I didn't even create any of my author social medias until after the book came out, because in my head I was like, oh, there's no point in doing that. There's nothing for anyone to click on. There's nothing for anyone to look at, because but now I'm looking back and I'm like, that could have been a good way to network and build up hype and meet other people. And I missed all that opportunity because in my head I was like, don't really know what I want to do. And that indecisiveness has definitely, I don't want to say cost me, because it's not like I expected to take off right away. I don't know. On the one hand, that would be cool. But on the other hand, I think that would be more scary than cool. Like, I get a little anxious because even with social medias and TikTok and stuff like that, you never know what's going to go viral. You know, one day I could put a meme with my book cover and then bam, million people see it. And it's just like, oh my gosh, amazing. And then that opens the floodgates to
Absolutely.
everything. I don't know if I really want that right now.
Mm.
I'm not saying I would feel like that forever, but especially right now. I mean, I like being a little low key at the moment, because even doing an author interview is a little bit like, I'm being perceived and asked questions. And but then on the other hand, I really, really love it when people review my book and give me their thoughts, or they DM me and say, oh, I read your book, here's what I think, here's my favorite character. And I'm like, yes, talk to me about it. That is such a difficult question, honestly, because I feel a little bit both ways about it. I don't think I'd want to be like well known right now. I'm happy being a little obscure.
Definitely. And a lot of people will agree to very much the same thing, that, right now at the moment, they want to just be under the radar a bit to just grow their authorial voice. And going back to this discussion of, the first book will get your name out there in the sense that it'll get your foot in the door. And it may take your 5th, 7th, 10th book or 20th book. I've had a lot of authors on the show who have said that their book that we discuss in their respective interviews is like their 20th book that they've written that really got their name out there. And that's okay. That is absolutely fine, because then you can look at it and say, if you enjoyed this book, check out 19 all the way down to number 1, see my growth as an author. And what do you do? All right, so what do you have now? You have new fans. You now have an established presence. You've honed your craft, and you're just going to keep getting better as time goes on. And that's absolutely fine. And also within that period of time, one thing I think is important to talk about is, of course, networking and connecting in the indie author community. I cannot tell you like how many authors, DeMoor, actually a majority of the authors that I've had on this show for 2 years now, word of mouth from a friend that I've had on the show previously. It's absolutely insane, and I've learned so much from them. So for you, DeMoor, who has helped you understand the industry a little bit better? And are there any personal shout outs you'd like to give to friends, family, fellow authors, etc.?
Yeah, actually. So I don't know a lot of published authors. Like, I don't know anyone famous or anything like that. And I met a few other writers over time. Like, just, I joined a couple of writing groups and stuff like that. But I did not have a clue what I was doing when I decided to self-publish. Or even when I was querying agents. I think probably the first 45 agents I queried, my query letter was awful. But I didn't know. All I knew was looking at guides. I didn't have anyone who had the experience to sort of consult or lean on or get guidance from. And it's really the same with the self-publishing, or writing in general, to be honest, publishing aside, just writing in general.
Right.
I had a couple friends who like to write, but different genre as well, different writing styles. We would read each other's stuff and give feedback and all of that stuff. But I never took a creative writing class.
Ah,
I
okay.
never, I literally woke up one day and just started writing a book. It's very bizarre. Um, but I had one of my friends, shout out to Kai McKay, who's amazing. He wrote a book called Tale of the Wanderer. He's doing a bit of a rewrite at the moment, a little bit of a revamp. And he's been fantastic when it comes to like advice with self-publishing. But also my friend Connor, who he's a proofreader
Mm,
professionally. And he has a lot of connections that I didn't have, a lot of insight, a lot of experience. But even then, he was like, I can just sort of give you guidance, not tell you what to do or how to do it. Ultimately, you need to decide what you want to do. Um, so yeah, shout out to those two because they're amazing. And also shout out to you because you're doing this interview with me. um,
thank you.
but yeah, I definitely feel like this whole process has been sort of a challenging learning experience that I had to do sort of on my own. Um, because I just simply just didn't know anyone who had done this before. And this
Mm,
isn't the first time in my life I've experienced something like this. You know, I moved to another country, never knew, didn't know anyone else who had ever done that, and so I had to figure it out on my own. And I was like, well, if I can do that, I can do anything. Um, but also, I asked like a forum, you know, of self-publishing sort of page, and I was like, what's your advice here? And so I can't really shout out anyone specific from that because it was just sort of general advice again, but I think that's also why I'm still a little bit obscure because frankly, and I'm not even going to sugarcoat it, I didn't know what I was doing.
mm-hmm.
And I still don't really. Like, part of me is like, should I pay for ads? Should I pay this person to help promote? Should I do that? Like, what's the right thing to do? Oh, I should have done this. I should have created my socials earlier. I should have. And the fact of the matter is, I don't have a clue. I'm just like, the book's out. What now?
Right.
um, and it's intimidating because it makes me feel a little bit like, well, why would anyone want to read or buy your book if you don't know what you're doing? But I also want to be transparent, and I'm not all
Yeah.
knowing, you know, and it's the learning process. Sorry, that was a long ramble from your question, but um, yeah, I didn't really have like a mentor or anything like that when it comes to this. It was definitely asking questions on forums, asking people, do you know anything about this? And then being told no. um,
Absolutely. And I'm pretty much the same way. Like when I started, I didn't know which route to go to. Like I started with Barnes and Noble and just worked from there. And I have gradually, improved the last few books. Like my first two books, I didn't do any beta readers or ARC readers. I just had them edited and published. For
mhm.
Michael, I took my time. I actually got ARC readers for it to let him know, hey, this is when the book is going to be published. I need the reviews by then.
Mhm.
And the feedback has been little bit more supportive. I don't want to say supportive, but has been more positive. And now for my fourth book, Decimals, I've now done a beta reads application. I have about my 6 solid people that I know. I know people say like, oh, you need 100. Yeah, but if you have like 100 people, how many of those 100 people are actually going to give you feedback? I'd rather have a small number of loyal readers that I know personally that are going to give me, feedback, and then I can also rely upon to be ARC readers for this book when it comes out.
Absolutely.
And yeah,
Yeah, I had 8 beta readers. 8. Because I was like, I think, I mean, oh, 100 would, oh, look at all the feedback you got. That's too much feedback. That's too much. Like, I think I personally would have been so overwhelmed if I would have had the 8 beta readers that were fantastic. They all got back to me. They all answered the questions. Um, they were amazing. That was enough because it really, I mean, it took me months to edit the book after all the beta readers gave me their feedback.
right.
And it's just like, I couldn't imagine more than that. I couldn't imagine it. And then with the arcs, I didn't know what an arc was. I was like, what is this? What? I thought you just needed beta readers. What's going on? And then a friend of a friend had a friend who had published before, and she sent me an email and she said, oh, ARC readers are like an advanced reader copy and they can leave reviews or give you feedback, and it's not a beta, it's different. I'm like, oh my goodness, what is going on here? And so I was very lucky that I even found out about that, because I had a few arcs. Now, I think I made the mistake of waiting too long. Like I said, I didn't have any socials until the book was out, and so I didn't advertise the arc, which was a mistake on my part, because now I signed up to get arcs, and I really didn't have that many, which was unfortunate, because I think that really could have helped with like visibility or something like that. But lesson learned, you know. And I think for my next book, because Child of the Flowers, I think you could read it as a standalone, but it will continue. The story will continue. I'm already working on book 2. Woo! But I think for the next one, I'll definitely have a better idea of what I'm doing this time, and I can actually, I don't know, build up hype or something. And then, like, if people see that and they're like, "Ooh, interesting, I should read the first one first." Because I think if you jump into book 2, you're going to be like, what is going on? Because most of the thing is done in the first book. You jump in not knowing anything about what's going on. But yeah, I'll definitely know what I'm doing next time. Hopefully, well, better, at least.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we now reach the final question of this interview, DeMoor.
Okay.
And here is the final question. So, with everything you've learned thus far in your own journey as an author, what is your word of wisdom to fellow writers and authors who are just starting out themselves?
So, one of the biggest, one of the most common comments I get from either people who I know are actively like to write, or people who say, oh, I'd love to write a book, but, you know, name your reason. I think a lot of writers get discouraged when they have writer's block, or no motivation, no time, or they can't connect those dots right with the lines that I mentioned. And I think that just being discouraged can honestly crush someone's motivation and confidence. But I just want to remind other writers that, and look, this is coming from me, who's like, I wish I could take my own advice most of the time, but there is real life going on outside of the fantasy life in your head. And I think that it's important to remember that just because you're going day to day, living your real life, it doesn't mean that you're like failing at writing or failing at telling your story. It just might take a little bit longer. And unless you've signed a contract with the publisher where you have a deadline, you have time to do what you need to do. I mean, for some people, it takes 10 years to write a book because their real life gets in the way, or they struggle with the ideas or the flow or something like that. You know, I'm sort of the opposite. It only took me 2 years to go from concept to a full first draft, but it took me 5 additional years to get from editing to publishing for various reasons. I mean, I moved to another country, I got married, I did all kinds of stuff that just sort of obviously took priority over all of that. And I think a lot of writers get discouraged, especially when they're like, well, I can't think of anything. I don't have any motivation. And I understand 100%. Like with book 2 right now, I'm sat here with my notes app full of ideas and no motivation to actually write them down. And I think, you know, I don't necessarily have a deadline, but now that my book's out, and some people loved it and want book 2, and I'm like, oh God, I need to get on that. But I don't necessarily, because if you rush, I don't know, if you force it, it's not gonna, I think if you force it, you're gonna look at it and be like, oh, this sucks. Oh, I suck as a writer. Oh, I should give up. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think that it's important. And then I guess on the flip side, to published authors, to people who have made it to that stage and their book is out there, I don't know if I'm the best person to give advice because I've only been published for like a month. But, and I'm reading straight from my notes here, sorry.
No problem.
The biggest thing I've learned from the process is to accept that your book may not be some people's cup of tea.
Yes.
There are going to be people who don't like it. And I think that you're either going to have people who it's not their cup of tea, they didn't finish it, they didn't like it, and then you're going to have other people who devour it like they're dying of thirst. And it's really just accepting that you were brave enough to put it out there into the world. And just to remember that you did that step, it's out there now, and not take anything too much to heart. And like I said, I do want to follow my own advice. It's hard though, and I understand that it's hard.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect way to end this amazing author interview here on the channel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the final episode for the month of December and the final episode of 2024. A huge thank you to Mollie DeMoor for coming on the show, making her official debut on the channel. Mollie, thank you so very much. And before we end, where can people find you on social media, as well as purchase a copy of Children of the Flower?
So right now, my book is only available on Amazon. Now that's not permanent. I will be publishing it through Ingram Spark at some point, but right now it's on Kindle Unlimited. So if you have a subscription to that, you could read it for free. It's also available in paperback, hardcover, hopefully in January. As for socials, I have a Twitter or X, and I have an Instagram and a TikTok. I'm working on making a website, but I don't have one yet. And if you do end up finding yourself interested and you read it, if you want to leave a review or talk to me about it or whatever, that's fine too. Instagram DMs are there for that. You know, I'd say Instagram is probably where I'm the most active, because I'm really enjoying Bookstagram right now. Yeah.
Awesome. I'll link all that down below in the description of this video. And I will also link down, well, before I say this, Mollie, do you still have your Inkitt account still active, or did you remove that?
It's gone, I'm afraid.
I was going to link that.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's completely gone. I just wasn't using it anymore. And to be honest, any friends that I had made off of Inkitt, I speak to outside of the site at this point. So just got rid of it. Yeah.
All right. Well, no worries. I will link all the other socials and links to the book down below. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the final episode, as I mentioned before. And stay tuned for next month's and next year's lineup of guests. I am so excited. I've already have a few already confirmed. So just stay tuned for all that stuff. And also, make sure to buy your copy of Michael, Last Angel of Earth on ebook. It's still available now until the end of December. Just make sure to head over to my previous episodes, because it will link the code to get 50% off on the ebook. I'll also link it down here so you can go and check it out as well. And as always, a huge thank you to Mollie for coming on the show, and we wish her the very best going forward. And who knows, when the second book comes out, I will definitely have Mollie back on the show again to tell us all about that book. So just make sure to follow her social media and make sure to stay up to date with mine on Instagram and LinkedIn for the newsletter. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and comment down below what was your favorite episode for this month and this year. And until then, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wanderer Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.